Good morning, everybody. Are you all set up and ready to roll? We can take a few extra minutes if you need it.
I just needed to tell Adam what we're doing, he's saying if he should record 8804, kind of this.
All set?
Yep.
All right, so good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Robert Holzberg. I'm a partner here at the law firm of Pullman and Conley, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today. As I begin, let me please introduce to you the Most Reverend Bishop Frank Caggiano. He's the gentleman with the collar in case there's any question about his role. And I'd also like to introduce the wonderful team who worked by my side with me for this entire time. Adam Mosciolo, Trish LaBelle-Lassie, and Kristen Perkins. And hiding in the corner is Ann McCrory, who is the Chief Legal Officer for the diocese, and she's been my principal liaison for the past year. Let me just give you the order of events briefly. What I'd like to do is take you through my methodology, my key findings, and my recommendations, and then I'll yield the podium to Bishop Caggiano, and when he is done, we'll both be available for questions, both up here, and if you would like to have personal, individualized interviews, that can be arranged as well. And I should indicate that Sally LaRoche is our media representative from Pullman and Conley, and John Grasso and Brian, they're here, they're from the diocese, so if you have any questions, please contact them. In addition, I think you're aware that our report has been uploaded, and there are hard copies here. If you run out, please ask for additional ones. So let me begin at the top. We were retained exactly a year ago, not quite exactly a year ago, 364 days ago, on October 2nd, 2018. I told the bishop that this report would be in under a year, and I overpromised by one day. And his charge to us was clear and was precise and very specific. We were retained for the purpose of investigating and reporting to the diocese and to the community at large the incidents of clergy sexual abuse of minors from 1953 through the present. That's a 66-year span. And in addition, and perhaps more importantly, we were also directed to report on the response to that abuse by the institution itself and by the individual bishops. And we've prepared a very comprehensive, I believe, report. You'll have it available to you. What I propose to do is just highlight our top line findings. As we began this process, we committed ourselves to three principal guidelines, or North Stars, if you will. And they're as follows: that in order to fulfill and respond accurately to the bishop's mandate, it's necessary that we document and report the profound injury that's been suffered by the various communities of the diocese. And first and foremost, of course, that includes the injury to the survivors. And we spend a considerable amount of time in our report chronicling the terrible impact in many cases that the abuse has had on them, the pain and anguish that they've carried throughout their lives, and the impact that's had both on them, on their families, and on their loved ones. But it's not only the survivors who have suffered as a result of this prolonged problem, it's also the members of the faithful. Many have reported to us that their faith, if it's not been shattered, has at least been called into question. And the good, hardworking priests who came to the priesthood for all the right reasons and who tried to discharge their obligations daily have also suffered. And I will tell you in a few minutes that the number of priests who we've identified as being abusers constitutes about 5% of the entire cohort of priests who've served the diocese over the last 65 years. So that means that there's 95% of the priests today who carry, to some degree or other, the stigma of the misdeeds of their brothers. And finally, and it's worth mentioning and underscoring, the institution itself, we have discovered, has suffered. And I often ask myself, over the past year, I've often asked myself, what would the $56 million that has been spent to resolve cases have done in terms of bolstering the diocese's commitment to its school system, to feeding the hungry, and to helping all of those to whom it has a commitment. Our second principle and guideline is that we would be thorough, and we'd be accurate, and we'd be honest. That is the nature of the oath I took as a judge in 1990 when I was sworn in by Governor O'Neill, and that is the same obligation that I hope that I and my team have brought to this report and investigation. And let me share with you, if I might, just one brief anecdote. When I was in discussions with Attorney McCrory a year ago about whether I'd be retained and the scope of the engagement, I said to her that it's really important that I meet with the bishop, because I need to understand that he's committed to this, and he needs to understand that I will only undertake this engagement if there's a clear recognition that our report will follow no certain path, that it will not play favorites, and that will call the facts out as we find them. And he said to me in a word, I'm hiring you and I'm getting out of your way. If you have any problems, here's my personal phone call, line, and call me anytime. Unfortunately, I'm happy to report I've never had to take advantage of that opportunity or that offer. Third, we have been committed to a process that casts as wide a net as possible. We believed it was important at the outset that we gather as much information as is possible, and that we interview as many people who are either witnesses or have some interest in the events of the last 65 years. And in that regard, let me indicate that we've had the full cooperation of the bishop, his chief administrative officers, the priests, and the staff of the diocese. We believe, of course it can never be 100% certain, that we have had access, full and complete access, to every archive, to every room, to every filing cabinet, to every safe, to every office in the diocese. And let me just show to you, there's been a lot written over the years about the so-called secret archives. We deal with that in our report. I don't want to get lost in the weeds today. But I just want to illustrate for you and our readers, and this would be at Appendix 6 of the printed report, the area in the basement that stores many of the records of the past 65 years, including priest personnel files, writings of the bishops, and so on and so forth. And we've had access to that. And I mentioned we've had access to a safe that was locked. We retained a locksmith. We didn't find any secret papers, but we did find a chalice, which was returned. We have collected and analyzed over 250,000 paper and electronic records. Those have been digitized, and they will be provided to the diocese so that they can move forward with their program to update and modernize their digital system and their personnel record retention system. We have conducted over 50 interviews of survivors and representatives of survivor organizations. We have met with counsel for survivors. We have met with current and former counsel for the diocese. We have met with current and former bishops and their chief administrative officers. And we have retained and met with and analyzed our information with nationally recognized experts in the area of child abuse, mental health, diocesan administration, and archiving. And perhaps most importantly, I do want to highlight this. We deemed it critical at the beginning that we design and implement a robust outreach program. And we established an anonymous toll-free hotline that is still up and running, and the diocese will either take it over at the conclusion or they will retain their own independent hotline. We have advertised in the newspapers and in the digital media. There have been numerous postings on the diocesan website. There's been emails to all priests and outreach both, as I said before, to survivor groups and their representatives. Now let me take you through briefly the key findings of our report. I want to break it down into two parts. The first has to do with the initial charge to us to report out and describe the incidents of child sexual abuse by clergy from 1953 to the present. This section is largely statistical in nature. We note in our report that statistics by their nature are largely impersonal, but we must never forget, as we've tried not to forget, that behind every statistic, there is a human being with a story to tell and an injury to share. And let me begin also with this basic observation, that every act of abuse over the past 65 years was and is a violation of Connecticut criminal law. Every act of abuse over the past 65 years violates the priest's vows and canonical obligations. And the failure to report this abuse, at least since 1971, which was endemic to the institution at least until the 1990s, also constitutes an independent violation of Connecticut law. Full stop. To a certain extent, that's all we need to know. That the priests who committed these ghastly acts engaged in criminal acts, they violated their vows and their canonical obligations, and the bishops who failed to report violated their obligations under the mandated reporting law. But we know more, so let me share that with you. We've identified, and this information is largely consistent with what the diocese has determined based on its own investigations in response to court orders. We've identified 281 victims over the course of the past 65 years. Now, a little bit of nuance, if I might. The information in support of those claims varies. In many cases, the information is overwhelming and it is conclusive. In a certain swath of cases, the information is slightly more ambiguous. And in others, there's very little information. Sometimes just a single piece of paper in a file, or an anonymous complaint. Sometimes the file involves a claim of either a victim or a priest who is deceased. But in any event, the bottom line for our purposes is we have identified 281 victims. We believe that there may be more, because as we report, Bishop Curtis acknowledged that he destroyed records and purged files. So with that information, it's impossible, of course, for us to know each and every single last victim or priest. Let me take you through some of the statistics about these victims, which I hope will be of interest to you. The ages of the victims range from 5 to 18 years, and the gender is distributed as follows: 75% male, 16% female. I should say the sex is distributed in that fashion. 9% of the sex is simply unknown, and that's chronicled in the PowerPoint slide that's in front of you, and that can be located at Appendix G of our report. And here's another presentation, again showing the distribution of sex by percentage. Now, of note is that the distribution of abuse across the decades, that is from 1953 to present, is uneven. And I don't want to overwhelm you with statistics. All of this is covered, but let me just highlight this because I think it's important to know. We've identified 21 incidents of abuse during the administration of the first bishop, that's Bishop Sheehan, from 1953 to 61. We've identified 217 incidents of abuse during the administration of Bishop Walter Curtis. He served from 1961 to 1988. 27 incidents of abuse during the administration of Bishop Edward Egan, who served from 88 to 2000. There were 2 reported incidents of abuse during now Archbishop Lori's administration from 2001 to 2012, and no reported incidents during Bishop Caggiano's administration from 2013 to the present. And what we know in connection with the distribution of abuse is that oftentimes there's a significant delay in the reporting of the abuse. So, for example, it may be the case, this is an example, that a young person was abused in 1970, but may not come forward until 1990. And that is captured in slide E. And I don't know if you can see, but the peak of abuse occurred in 1970,
roughly, 114 cases in that era. And you can see the reporting peaked in around 2005, 105 cases.
And this is consistent with national research and national numbers. Nothing unusual about it, but it's important to keep in mind that one of the profound consequences of being abused is the inability, oftentimes, we hope it's changing, but the inability to come forward, to feel comfortable about reporting that. And one of the things that has been noted is that the Boston Globe 2002 article and the explosion of reportage about clerical abuse allowed many people to come forward and feel more comfortable, and we hope that pattern continues. Now, let me talk about the priests. I've given you some basic data points about the victims. Let me tell you that we've identified 75 priests who have abused or have been alleged to have abused minors during the course of the 65 years. And what is fascinating to me and intriguing is that 10 of the priests, 10 of the 71, are responsible for 61% of the abuse. Put in other terms, I indicated a second ago that we identified 281 victims. These 10 priests abused 172 of those 281 victims, or 61%. And this slide can be found in Appendix M. With respect to these 71 priests, they fall into some different buckets. I don't want to get lost in the weeds today, but I simply refer you to part 6 of our report for a deeper analysis. So let me get now to the heart of our investigation, which has to do with the bishop's response and the administration response to this horrific story. We note in our report that if there were a subtitle to it, we would call it A Tale of Two Cities. Why? Because that title suggests what we have identified, namely, that during the administrations of Bishop Curtis and Egan, and to a lesser extent during the administration of Bishop Egan, that they suffered from significant handicaps involving, first of all, a failure of attitude, and secondly, an absence of compassion. And third, they labored under a sense of misplaced priorities. They viewed their obligation, they being Bishops Egan and Sheen, not to protect the victims or the young people of the diocese principally, or the congregation, or even their fellow priests, but rather to protect the institution. And throughout their writings and correspondence, which we chronicle in detail in our report, there's repeated reference, particularly by Bishop Egan, to his perceived obligation to protect and preserve the assets of the diocese, number one, and to protect the diocese against what he described as scandalous news articles. And as a result of that attitude and those misplaced priorities, we conclude that there was a fundamental and deep-seated failure to implement and carry out policies that would protect the children of the diocese and to remove known or suspected abusers from service. Now, carrying forward with the theme of Tale of Two Cities, we have also reported that there has been a fundamental shift in approach by Bishops Lori and Caggiano. We've described them as having inaugurated a new approach in which their priorities are the protection of children, removal promptly of abusive priests, extending compassion and a helping hand to survivors. And while there's more work to be done and we have a list of recommendations, we believe that their attitude and their approach stands in stark contrast to that of Bishops Egan and Curtis. Now let me quickly take you through, before I close, a laundry list of failures that we believe we've identified and documented with respect to the Egan and Curtis administrations. First, as I've referenced before, they failed to move decisively and promptly to remove known and suspected abusers from the priesthood. Why was that? Bishop Egan reportedly told us in his correspondence that he was afraid that if he assembled the documentation and sent it off to the Vatican, documentation that was necessary to remove priests from the clerical state, that documentation would somehow end up in the hands of counsel for the plaintiffs, and it would invite litigation against the diocese and expose the diocese to extensive settlement payments. Secondly, their administrations were characterized by a pattern of assigning and reassigning known and abusive priests, creating risks to others. And we identified these priests in part 7 of our report. Third, they repeatedly ignored warning signs and red flags, seemingly always crediting the denials of the priests over the statements of the victims. Fourth, there was a fundamental failure of transparency. Their decisions were oftentimes shrouded in euphemisms, if not outright lies. Repeatedly, we saw a reference to a priest being out for medical reasons, or a priest being on sabbatical. And in one case, of course, which has been well reported, the quote is, if anybody asks, he has hepatitis. Equally important, number 5, there was demonstrated consistently across their administrations a lack of compassion and support for the survivors, often bordering on hostility and derision. And we document this in our report, and we invite you to take a careful look at the very troubling and concerning quotes that we reference. Sixth, there was a misplaced reliance on psychiatric and mental health providers. That is a long story. I don't have enough time to go into it today. Again, I refer you to part 7 of our report. There was a failure from at least 1971, when priests became mandated reporters, to approximately 2000 to comply with that law. And in many instances, we determined and have determined that there was not even an appreciation of the existence of that law, let alone training. And finally, and perhaps equally troublesome, at least during the Bishop Egan administration, we have identified what I call a scorched earth litigation strategy. A strategy that ultimately re-victimized the victims, that needlessly prolonged the litigation, and undoubtedly, in my mind, as an experienced mediator and a trial judge for almost 23 years, escalated dramatically the cost of the settlements. We have identified very significant and positive improvements that have been ushered in by Bishops Lori and Caggiano. These include a commitment, a renewed commitment to robust prevention and training, to quickly removing abusive priests, to strictly enforcing a zero tolerance policy, to extending and renewing efforts at compassion and outreach, to upgrading the Safe Environment Program, and to placing greater emphasis on transparency and accountability. And of course, as with any institution or any leaders of any institution, there's always work to be done. So in part 8 of our report, we have provided to the bishop and his administrators a series of recommendations, which include amongst the following.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Could you please repeat it?
No. Does anybody have this on tape?
It's my cell phone,
Okay,
actually.
Those recommendations, again, in part 8 of our report in detail, of course, involved a continued robust commitment to survivor outreach and healing. We recommend that should there be an allegation of sexual abuse against any bishop of this diocese, that be reviewed by an independent, neutral third party who is not a cleric, either fellow bishop or priest. We think it's important that their record keeping and files be updated. We're in the process, as I mentioned before, of sharing with them all the digitized files that we've created. We have recommended a second review of certain files involving certain priests. We encourage the bishop and his staff to continue their very fulsome support of the Safe Environment Program. We have specific recommendations. I'd simply note that one of our experts is a woman by the name of Barbara Thorpe, who is the former director of the Boston Diocese Safe Environment Program. She is happy to chat with you, and in our appendix we have a very detailed list of her recommendations. And of course, we encourage the diocese to continue to implement an anonymous third-party reporting system. So I thank you for your attention. I've gone on a little longer than I anticipated, but I want to yield the floor to Bishop Caggiano at this point.
Good morning, everyone. Allow me first to offer my sincere word of thanks to all of you for being here today, and a very heartfelt word of thanks to you, Judge, and to your team for all the work that you have done to assemble this report, and for the professionalism and hard work that you have shown, and all of you have shown throughout this year. I thank you for that. As the judge indicated, allow me also to summarize briefly why on October of last year I asked him to begin the process of creating what is now before you, this comprehensive independent report. I had in mind three basic objectives. First and foremost was to independently assure that the safety of our children and our young people was being sustained and maintained in complete compliance with the Dallas Charter, and reinforcing that our safe environments, which are there for our children entrusted to our care to be able to grow in wisdom and grace, were actually being maintained. As the report demonstrates very clearly, much good work has been done in that regard over the last 18 years. And we continue to maintain and will forever maintain a zero tolerance for any priest who is credibly accused of abuse of any form. It is the sacred duty of the Church to protect our young people, and we're committed to ensure that this grave crime and grave sin will never happen again in our midst. But the second objective was also to provide a very transparent account, as complete as possible, of the extent of clergy sexual abuse in our diocese from its inception in 1953. And finally, and equally importantly, is to give an independent accounting of how diocesan leadership in all of its different forms, how they reacted, whether appropriately or not, to this crime and this evil in our midst, and to indicate an honest assessment. My friends, when you have an opportunity to read this report, I believe, Judge and your team, you have very well achieved all three objectives. And in the series of recommendations that appear at the end of the report, I stand before you totally committed to enact those recommendations as quickly as is possible. Allow me, just as the shepherd of the diocese, to offer perhaps more personal remarks. It is undoubtedly true, my friends, that having lived through this very dark and sad hour, that the Church has been changed, perhaps for the rest of our lifetimes and beyond, because of the evil and crime of abuse of minors. It is a wound that I am very much aware will take a very long time to fully heal. However, this report, I believe, is an important and essential step in our ongoing efforts to bring healing to anyone who has been wounded by this scourge. And they are many, as the judge indicated. First and foremost, as I stand before you on this very historic moment, my heart goes out to all those who were harmed and victimized and who survive each day with some very deep scars that the abuse that they encountered has carved into their very lives. I am deeply sorry for that betrayal and for that great pain and suffering that each of you who have been abused, victimized, who are survivors, have endured. And I pledge to you, my own personal pledge and the pledge of this diocese, that we will accompany you in any way we can on the road to healing. But I'm also very mindful that to those whose relatives and friends walked with you, particularly in those initial moments of coming forward, sharing painfully what happened, I'm also very sorry for them, for the pain that they endured, parents, brothers, sisters, relatives, and friends, who have endured as they courageously witnessed and accompanied you in your journey of healing. One of the hidden graces of this episode, this moment, this chapter in the life of our diocese, quite frankly, my friends, is I have had the great privilege to meet many of those who are surviving from the scars of abuse. Some of whom are here in this room, many of whom I consider now my friends, and they are all my co-workers. As we collaborate together to ensure that this evil will never occur again in our midst. But to those who are here present, I want to thank you for your friendship and for your leadership and for the support that you have given me in my ministry as bishop. As the judge says so beautifully, as I stand before you, I think of the many, many thousands of priests in our diocese who have been faithful witnesses and given generous service to their people. As the judge alluded, they too, we have all, clerics, been wounded by this grave sin and evil. Because many look upon us now with great suspicion simply because we are Catholic priests. I want to speak to all the priests of this diocese who have been faithful. I want them to know I also stand with you. And I will support you in any way I can as you go forward in your ministry. But I also expect from them, as I expect from myself, that we will live fully and completely the code of pastoral conduct that we have. So we will always assure that every child will always be in an environment that is safe and nurturing and consonant with the gospel and what the Lord and our Savior has asked us to do. Allow me also to express my thanks to the thousands and thousands of lay faithful in our diocese, whose trust in leadership has been very much tried and tested these past years. Today is an historic moment for us. Over a year ago, you made your voices heard, that you wanted an account that is independent, transparent, that is truly a full rendering of what has happened. And we have now arrived at that point of providing that. I promise I will continue to work as best I can to restore that trust and to be as transparent and as accountable as is humanly possible as we go forward to renew our diocese together. I also want to address myself to young people in our diocese, a group that I have had the privilege to work with in many different ways over the years, a group that is very close to my heart. You are the hope of change. You are the great gift of the Lord in our midst. And I know that I and everyone who works with me is recommitting ourselves today to stand with you, to serve you, to respect you, and to invite you into leadership in the church. In my prayer that this report will provide us the beginning of this new springtime of life in the church as we move forward. And allow me just to end with this. To all people who will be listening to this, reading this report, to all those in our society, as the church begins to emerge out of this dark chapter of its life, I wish to say to all people of every faith, all people of goodwill, that let us join together our efforts to create truly safe environments for all our children, wherever they may be, wherever they find themselves, so that we can eradicate this evil and this crime from our midst, no matter where it is found, no matter where it lurks in the shadows. I'm very grateful for your presence here, my friends, and for your attention. And I invite the judge to come forward because there may be questions, or I'm sure there are questions, maybe questions that you may want to ask.
Thank you, Bishop.
Thank you.
Before I take any questions, may I just add a quick yes? The bishop mentioned at the top of his comments that one of his goals, his commitments, is to be fully compliant with the United States Catholic Council of Bishops requirements or mandates. And we did look at that, and they are compliant, and in certain respects have gone beyond those mandates. I just want to make sure that that's clear. I'm happy to take any questions, or if you have questions for the bishop, he's standing right by my side.
Did you find anything that you needed to refer to law enforcement persons?
We did not, although we have recommended that going forward, that there be full compliance with a memo of understanding that was executed during Bishop Lori's administration, that all claims of abuse be forwarded to law enforcement authorities.
Of the 71 priests that were identified, do you know if any of them are still priests?
Let's see, 42 of them have been put on the diocesan, 41 of them, sorry, have been placed on the diocesan credibly accused list. And I'm going to look for assistance on this. I believe all of them have been removed from ministry. Is that correct? That's correct. So 41 have been removed out of the 71. There are an additional 10 priests who have been the subject of payments, civil settlements. And we have recommended that the diocese take a second look at those matters because of the payment and because of payments and because of other information we've discovered. I would anticipate that some of those may be placed on the credibly accused list and therefore removed from the diocese subsequently. But that's not a call that I make. That's up to the review board.
And you mentioned in your statement that there was a second review of certain files. Is that what you just
That's what I'm referring to. And just to put a fine point on it, there's another 20 priests as to whom there are allegations that are not supported by significant or meaningful evidence. I refer to the anonymous complaint or a complaint that came forward after either the priest or the victim passed away. It's our feeling that there ought to be at least a secondary look at those files so that the community at large and the diocesan community can be assured that all of the available information has been excavated and reviewed. We've undertaken a very sophisticated digital search of these records, and it's our belief, although we haven't confirmed it, that there may be additional information that's relevant to some or all of these cases.
Judge, how many records are missing? You mentioned that there are records that were destroyed. Do you have any idea how many years worth of records were destroyed, or a sense of?
I don't have a sense of the scope of it. Bishop Curtis, in his deposition in connection with litigation dating back to the 90s, acknowledged that he had, quote, purged certain files. There is no clarity as to how many files he may have taken documents out of. I will say that there are thousands and thousands of files and pieces of paper in the diocesan archives. So my sense is that this was a limited effort, if I can use that word, by Bishop Curtis. We have looked at or reviewed almost 1,500 personnel files, and it's not obvious to us that records have been destroyed or removed. But of course, we can never know, because you can't prove a negative, of course.
I wanted to ask the bishop,
Yes,
are there, and you just mentioned a couple numbers, but are there cases that are pending now or potential reports that are still being reviewed of priests that are still in the diocese? Just a couple of weeks ago, you announced, I mean, Gennario is now obviously gone, but are there more that you're concerned about that are being reviewed right now that have been brought up by this, or?
Well, first, when we receive information, we promptly, immediately act on it. And to the extent that it requires, it goes to the review board for an accounting. So some of the recent decisions that priests have been made, have been declared credibly accused, is because new information has come forward, and we are committed to continue to do that. Part of what the judge is alluding to is that there was, for a very long time, a decision made that those who are deceased would not necessarily, upon being deceased, that have their cases reviewed by the review board, because if you recall the Dallas Charter, its purpose was to ensure that we had a safe environment. So that if a priest who was abusive was dead, then of course he could no longer harm anyone. But I reversed that decision 2 years ago. And many of those who are deceased now have been going through the process of review in the review board. Most, if not almost all, have gone once. Some have gone even twice, but you can imagine, my friends, that when someone is dead and cannot speak for themselves or nor defend themselves, it becomes a much more deliberative, conscious, and therefore time-consuming process to ensure that if someone is declared to be credibly accused, that the review board has done its due diligence, and I have done my own as well, getting their recommendations. So everyone who has been credibly accused and alive is out of ministry, period. Among the dead, we are still working through that process. We are almost complete in that review. There may be a few more that have to be done, and those are those who are probably very long dead in the scope. Please.
Another question.
Please.
This has been an ongoing thing for, I don't know, I've probably written stories going back to the 90s. We still, occasionally there's a lawsuit that comes up. I'm sure there's been a few files since this started. What do you say to people that just don't believe that the church is ever going to fix this problem?
My mother used to say, to break trust is easy. To rebuild it may take a lifetime. And I stand before you in all humility, recognizing the fact, and that is why I'm very grateful to the judge and his team, because this report is the bare, honest assessment, independently of the facts. There may be some who will dispute the report, and quite frankly, I'm not exactly sure how to respond to that. I'm not sure how even the judge would respond to that. But when you have a wound, you need to clean it out completely, or it really cannot heal. And I believe this is an historic moment when the wound has totally been cleaned right through. And there is a tremendous amount of detail in this report that you and everyone who would like to read it is welcome to do. In fact, I encourage you to do it. So for those who may still not believe this is a full accounting, perhaps they could address it to the judge, address it to his team, but I'm not sure transparency gets any more transparent than this.
Was there anything in this report that surprised you, or any names, or anything that you were surprised about when you saw it?
It's an interesting question. Insofar as much of what is in this report has already been made public in different fora around, in the last 15 years. What is new is that it has been independently assessed and it has been compiled in a single narrative. So now there is a comprehensive accounting and description. So did anything in particular surprise me? No, but I stand before you quite sober, somber, and deeply sorrowful for at least the portion of the narrative that describes how this crisis was addressed in prior generations. May I quote someone? John Henry Newman, who will be canonized in a few weeks, the great Anglican convert, once said, "To live is to change, and to become perfect is to change often." I think part of what the judge is demonstrating in his narrative with his team is that the church has very much changed. We are not perfect. We have much more yet to do, as any institution needs to do. But my takeaway message to the people listening to you is that there is a new chapter already being written for 18 years. And I'm committed to keep doing that. And maybe my hope is that will surprise many people. Judge?
Are there any additional questions?
You described sort of where things stand with the 10 priests that, I guess, have been subject to these additional payments. What is kind of the process? Is there a process that you're going through right now?
We have recommended as one of our proposals that the review board reconsider their cases. So when that will happen and how quickly that will happen is a matter that's in the hands of the diocese. I don't know if anyone wants to get that close.
May I just also add this? For those 10 priests, many of those settlements were part of global settlements that were made. And none of them, to this point, given the evidence we have, and having been reviewed by the review board at least once, are credibly accused of what was claimed. But nonetheless, settlements were made for the greater good of the individuals at large. And quite frankly, there could have been also a strategic decision that to have not settled would have then just prolonged the process to the detriment of everyone, including the people who are coming forward. The judge is recommending that we look at those again, and we will dutifully do that.
Did I introduce my teammates before at the beginning?
Yes.
I did, okay. I don't want to get taken out of here in shackles. Okay.
Judge,
Yes.
I missed at the beginning, how many victims did you and your team actually interview? Do you know?
There's a listing in,
What's the appendix? Do you know of the appendix A? Has the list of all the persons we've interviewed. I would say probably, I don't have the precise number, somewhere in the vicinity of 10 or 12. We did, as I said, undertake a robust outreach program. We would have liked and hoped that more people would have spoken to us, but that, of course, is a personal decision, deeply personal, that we respect.
I mean, do you feel that there are probably a lot of victims who are still even now afraid to come forward, or just have never been able to process it to the point where they would participate in something like this or come forward?
I don't know that from firsthand information because we haven't spoken to those people, but we spent a considerable amount of time looking at the research and the literature and the sort of the history of victimization, and it certainly would be consistent with what we know, that people would be reluctant to come forward for a variety of reasons, all of which, of course, are deeply, deeply personal and very understandable.
And if I may just interject another point, part of my reasoning for reversing the longstanding policy that the dead not come to the review board if an accusation is made once they are dead is precisely in support of potential victims. So that if there are those in the larger community who were victimized or hurt, that making that public in such a way is to empower them to come forward.
And on the memorandum of understanding, the state's attorney, I believe, that you mentioned, is there something that the diocese should be doing there that it isn't, or some changes that it needs to make in that?
Well, the diocese has the other current mandated reporting laws. The diocese has the option of reporting any known or suspected abuse either to the Department of Children and Families, which is the designated agency that receives these reports, or to the local law enforcement authorities. We're recommending that they refer these cases to both entities. I will tell you that it's our assessment that the diocese currently is far exceeding the mandate required by state law in terms of referring to the Department of Children and Families. They have an existing policy that requires all cases of abuse, no matter the age of the victim or the date of the alleged incident to be reported. It's not clear that the statute requires that, but I believe it's the bishop's position that as a prophylactic rule, he wants everything reported up the line.
And how is the report made for?
Pardon me?
How is the report made for?
The diocese pays our bills. I don't know if it wants to be there.
Well, the full accounting of it, we're still working through. But you may know, last year, we issued a financial accountability report. And every year, I had promised we would update that report. So before the end of the year, we will update it. And all of the comprehensive costs of what this has, will be in that report. So it'll be in the next, probably in the next couple of months, you'll have a full accounting.
Yes, sir.
Question?
Follow?
Do you have a total dollar figure, total cost of the report?
So, our bills, some of our bills are still outstanding. As I mentioned to you before, we've hired outside vendors. Those bills are still outstanding, so when they come in, we'll transmit them to the diocese, and they will then report out the bottom line. Anything else?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.